2, 1. Hello and welcome to everyone here at Southfields Library and to everyone tuning in for this World Book Day edition of Children's Authors Live. We've got schools from all over the country tuning in, including Cardinal Wiseman Catholic Technology School, Eaton Bank Academy, Southfields Primary, Aston Academy and Glossopdale Community College. And excitingly, we're also going international today and we've got the American School of Madrid tuning in. So thanks so much, guys. We're so lucky today to be joined by best-selling author Robert Muchamore to celebrate the paperback edition of his latest book, Rock War Bootcamp, which is out on the 10th of March. You guys are going to have a chance at the end to ask Robert some questions, so have a think, and we'll be also taking questions from the people watching at home or in their classrooms. So without further ado, Robert Muchamore.
Hi everyone!
Okay, so Robert, seeing as it's World Book Day, my first question to you is, if you were dressing up today, what fictional character would you be and why?
Now this is interesting because I asked what the first question was going to be because they always say you should prepare the first question, and then I knew what the first question was going to be, but I totally forgot to think of an answer. So who would I dress up as? I always say people on World Book Day should dress up as the characters from my books. Especially cherub agents, because all you have to do to dress up as one of the kids from one of my books is you get a cherub t-shirt from my shop, which means I make money, and then you just wear jeans and trainers. So it's like the easiest World Book Day costume ever, and you don't have to like dress up as a dinosaur or trip over your Harry Potter scarf or anything like that.
That's a fantastic answer, and next year I will be dressing up as a cherub agent.
That's a good idea, yeah.
Talking about Cherub, it's been over 12 years and 17 books since Cherub first started. How does that make you feel?
You know, the whole thing of becoming an author is really interesting because it started off in about 2002, and I'm just a guy with an ordinary job, and I didn't even have an office then, and I was just sitting in my room at home, in my bedroom, and I had a computer, and I started thinking about writing a book for kids, and it was just this very small thing, and I didn't even think anyone would ever read it or that I'd be lucky if it even got published. And then this thing grew and it got bigger, and my first book came out, and it wasn't a big fuss when my first book came out, but they gradually got more popular, and the second book sold more than the first, and fans started getting in touch with me, and I started going around the world to places like Australia and America and France and Germany. And it's really fascinating how like my books have just grown from this tiny little idea to this this tiny little idea that I had in my room a few 10, 12 years ago, to be in this big massive thing that's completely changed my life and turned me into a successful author. So it actually just feels really special and really cool.
Fantastic. And your missions in Cherub, they're super realistic and pretty dangerous. Where do you get your ideas from? Is it current affairs, or do you just have this exceptional imagination?
So basically, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Cherub books are about kids who work as spies, but they're not like James Bond spies. They're not over the top. They don't have like jetpacks and special gadgets and all this amazing James Bondy type technology. The idea behind Cherub is they live in the real world, and they go on realistic missions. They go up against terrorist groups, they go up against drug dealers and things like that. So the idea is that Cherub feels really real, and when you read it you could almost feel that a Cherub agent could be someone like you. So when I'm writing a new Cherub book and I'm trying to think of where the idea is going to come from, what I'm always looking at is the real world. So I'm looking at things that are going on. For example, the last Cherub book, New Guard, which will be out later this year, is a mission, and it's set in the Middle East, and it's got an ISIS and a terrorist-based plot. So it's very much set in the present day. And I've also got plots about drug dealers and things like that. And I always just look at, whether it's a magazine, a newspaper, something you read in the internet, a book you read. So I'm always just looking around in the real world at ideas and thinking, that's a really interesting situation. That's something where I could write a story about Cherub agents.
And has your research ever gone past just reading about it? I mean, have you ever tested anything? Basically, have you fired a gun or set an explosion anywhere?
Yeah, I haven't exploded anything, not intentionally anyway. But yeah, I did do this really cool thing. I was in Las Vegas a few years back. And as most of you probably know, the gun laws in America are a lot more liberal than they are here. And you can basically go to a gun range. And I knew like loads of characters in my book are always firing guns. And I thought it would be really good to get an experience of firing guns. So I went to this place called Guns and Ammo Garage in Las Vegas, and it's like this big shooting range, and you pay for a package. It's quite expensive. It costs about $600-700, and they start you off just with like a normal kind of pistol, and you fire the pistol, and that's quite interesting. And then they give you like a Magnum 44, which is like the big Dirty Harry pistol, and you fire that, and it like really kicks in your hand. And the guns get bigger and bigger. They give you an Uzi machine gun, and then a Kalashnikov, and you end up, the last gun that you fire on this gun package is like this 20mm cannon, which is actually like bolted to the ground, and you're like dug, 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 and you're like shaking, firing this big gun. So that was a really, really fun piece of research, to go to this place and fire all these different guns, from little tiny pistols right up to gigantic machine guns.
And it doesn't sound scary at all.
Well, you're pointing, as long as you don't point, as long as you point the gun away, you're fairly safe.
Fab. Okay, so a bit about you as a writer now. When did you feel like you'd finally made it? When you finally became a successful author?
You know, I find this question about, you know, when are you a successful author? I find this really interesting, because what is success? And I think just this week, Amazon, the the online shopping site, they published this thing talking about how 40 of their sort of online self-published authors had sold 1 million books, and that was their definition of success. But I guess the way that I would define success for an author would basically be, most people who write for a living, they don't earn a lot of money. And my definition of success would be that you sell enough books to actually make a living and earn a decent amount of money. So, you know, you're not getting really rich, you're just earning as much money as, say, a teacher or a doctor or a nurse or something like that. And that's really nice, because you can basically write books and you can make a living doing it. You don't have to do anything else. And I guess when I got to that level would have been about 2 years after my first book came out. And what happened, I think my 3rd or 4th book had just come out, and we realised it was starting to sell quite well. And we also sold the rights for the books to be published in America, which meant I got some more money. And we also sold the film rights. So I was quite lucky, because within a couple of years of my first book coming out, I was at that level and I was comfortable, and I could say, right, I'm going to quit my regular job and I'm going to become a full-time writer. And obviously since then my books have become a lot more successful than that. But I think, you know, you're successful as a writer when you're making a decent living writing books.
Yeah. And what would you say is your secret to writing a really great, gripping story?
My secret to writing a great, gripping story. Is there anyone in this room who's ever thought that when they're older they'd like to be a writer? Yep, couple of hands going up, not very many. Oh yeah, now quite a lot of hands are going up. And the one thing I always say for people who want to be writers, you know, don't worry too much about the plot. It's important to have a good plot and to have a good story, but focus on characters, make good characters and make them interesting. And also have lots of conflict between your characters. Because one of the things in my books, people say, why isn't James Adams in the CHERUB series or Theo in the Rock War series? Why aren't they always good guys? Why do they do bad stuff? Why do they get in trouble? But that actually makes your characters much more interesting if they have flaws and if they have problems. And also relationships, you know, if they have a girlfriend, they break up. If they have a sister, like James Adams in my CHERUB books and Lauren Adams, his sister, they love each other very much, but they also argue and fight just like real people do, because it's that conflict between characters that actually drives stories and makes them really interesting. Yeah,
definitely. What would you say is the best and worst things about being an author?
The best and worst things about being an author? I guess one of the nicest things about being an author is that it gives you quite a lot of freedom. And I think about this on days like today, because on a day like today, I'm more like an ordinary person, because I've got to come here and come to this lovely library and speak to all of you people. And this morning I had to get out of bed at about 6 a.m. But normally as a writer, I can be a bit of a slob, because I just work in my office. And if I want to start work at 9:10, I can get out of bed at 9 o'clock, make a cup of coffee and walk to my office and work. And it's also quite nice that, you know, you don't have to go to the shops when they're busy on a Saturday. You don't have to go on holiday when the kids are off school. So being a writer gives you lots of freedom and lots of choices. The one thing that I don't like so much about being a writer is probably the fact that it can be quite isolating. Now, I'm someone who lives on my own. And I write for a living, so that means I can actually spend quite a lot of time at home on my own, and there aren't other people around. You don't have mates to chat to, and obviously I speak to other people and I go out and things like that. But I think being a writer, it can actually be quite isolating and it can be quite lonely, and that's quite a difficult thing sometimes when you're a bit bored or you're not having a good day and you're just kind of sat at your computer and you haven't got your mates to talk to or something like that.
Yeah, but days like today They're completely different. You get
And
to
of
talk
course,
to loads of
and of
people.
course, because we've got the wonderful Donna who makes everything magnificent.
Oh, thank you. Shucks. Right, in both Rock War and Lone Wolf, you've got very strong female main characters. Now, did you find writing from a teenage girl's perspective hard or harder than writing from a teenager's perspective? Did that make a difference, the gender?
I think it's difficult sometimes to write as a teenage girl because obviously the big difference is when I'm writing about a male character, I have been a teenage boy. And when you're writing about a girl character, there are aspects of a girl's life that I will never experience. So what you're doing is actually quite a new and quite a difficult thing to do. And basically the way around that, the way you do that is you're just honest. You just talk to people and you just have to be open. And, you know, I might say to my agent or someone at my publisher, you know, just read this thing, just look at it. Does it feel right? Does it feel like a girl character? And I was actually playing around last year and I was trying to write something. It's just a book I was thinking about writing. And I wrote a couple of chapters and I tried to write in the first person. So when you're writing in that person's voice. And it was the first time I'd ever tried to write as a girl. So I was writing like in the voice of a teenage girl. And it was really hard and I made 3 or 4 attempts to get it and I think I did finally get it right and I showed it to a few people and they liked it. But there's no doubt about it, writing for a female character, for a male, is obviously a bit more difficult than writing as a boy.
Yeah, yeah. Right, a couple of book unrelated questions. So when and where would you go in a time machine?
When and where would I go in a time machine? I'm finding it really hard to come up with a good answer for this. She asked me this question the other day. And I've decided that on Pancake Tuesday, a couple of weeks ago, I burned my pancakes. So what I would actually like to do is go back in time to Pancake Tuesday, walk to my stove and turn the stove down and take the pancakes off slightly before they burn and go horrible.
Yes, it's a great use of the flux
It's a great use of a time machine. What else would you want to do with it?
Okay, and if you had a superpower, what would it be?
If I had a superpower, now I think because I'm a writer, and as a writer what you're always trying to do is to get into other people's heads. So I reckon if I had a superpower, it would have to be to read people's minds. And it would be really interesting to see, you know, what's going on in this girl's here's mind and this boy here's mind. And it would just be fascinating to see, you know, what do people really think about you? What do they worry about? But also the other great thing about it was the great possibility for criminality, because I could also be looking at you going, oh, what's his PIN number? Oh, what's his keys to get in his locker at home? How can I, you know, so you could actually make loads of money out of it as well and be a massive crook.
Yes, yes. We don't advocate crime here at all.
No, if you do have superpowers, we do urge you not to use them to do evil.
Yes, 100%. And now this one I would like to really know the answer to. You're an animal in the zoo. What are you?
I'm an animal in the zoo.
Yeah. What would you be?
That's a tough one because I'm not really an animal loving person. But I guess it would be quite nice to be one of those sort of big cat type things, you know, because they always seem to live quite a nice life and you always see them, you know, they, excuse me, they run around a bit, they hunt the gazelle and, you know, they have a nice gazelle or something for lunch. And then they seem to spend the afternoon having a nice relaxing time, lying in the sun with their kids and their other lions and stuff like that. So I think, you know, that could be quite an enjoyable way to live your life, you know, to be a lion or something like that.
Yeah, pretty scary and tough as well.
Yeah, and also nobody would mess with me except maybe the elephants, you know.
Going back to you as a writer now, you write at least a book a year for the past however long, which means you must have done a ton of work. Do you have like a set amount of hours a day that you write, or do you have like a specific timetable that you adhere to?
This is funny because this is a question, if someone doesn't ask it to me, nearly always a teacher puts their hands up at the end and says, how do you structure your work? Because they always love the idea of, like, you know, getting kids to structure their lives and do their homework on time. And I think they always hope that I'm going to give this answer that I'm really, really organised. But I'm kind of, in some ways I am and in some ways I'm not, because when I get up in the morning and I start writing, because writing is a creative process, you never quite know how it's going to go. Some days you might get up and you write and you get a nice flow and you'll write a chapter or even 2 chapters and it all goes really well. Another day you'll get up and you'll just be stuck on a really difficult part of the story and you can't quite get it right in your head. And I found over the years that when you get into that kind of situation, you just have to back away. You know, I might do my accounts, I might go and do something else, I might go out for a walk, I might go shopping. So I can actually be quite random in the amount of work I do on any given day when I'm writing. The one thing I will say though is what's interesting is it always takes me about the same amount of time to write each book, around about 2.5 months to do the actual writing of a book. That's obviously after you've planned it and worked out what it is you're actually going to write. And that's actually quite interesting. So it sort of averages up. The good days and the bad days always average. And I always take about 2.5 months to actually write the book.
Yeah. And seeing as it is World Book Day today and lots of people are thinking about their favourite authors and who's inspired them, have you got any books or authors that have influenced you or really inspired you when you were younger and now as an adult?
I think the books that I really loved when I was a kid, probably a bit younger than you guys in this room, I used to love the Asterix books. And I think the thing I used to love about the Asterix books is just Obelix, the big fat guy, and it was just the fact that he was like this invincible guy who just used to go and beat the living hell out of everyone, and I just used to think that was really great.
Okay, let's turn now to Rock War, your latest series. You've got the paperback of the second book coming out this March. Of all the subjects you could have chosen following on from Cherub, why music?
So Cherub, as we said, that's my first series. That's my most successful series. It's been around for over 10 years now, and the 17th and final book in that series is coming out later this year. And Rock War is my new series. So this is the thing that I'm really excited about. This is the thing that I'm working on now, but actually not that many people know what it is yet. Now, the reason that I started doing Rock War, it actually came from my Cherub fans. And when I do book signings, not so much like this in a school when you're in your school uniforms, but I used to notice that quite a lot of kids were like wearing rock band shirts and stuff like that. And I always used to ask them and they were interested in music. And also, I used to have a fan forum online. It's moved off now because people do more Facebooky kind of stuff. But I always used to find that, like, on my online fan forum, there were more people talking about the X Factor and the Voice and talent shows and stuff like that than were actually talking about my books. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to do a book about, you know, kids who just start off as ordinary kids like you guys in this room, and who like go on. And the story of Rock War is basically it's about 3 different bands. And the kids, one band is going to end up at the end of the series as, you know, they're just going to be going back to their ordinary lives, and another band is going to be like really big and really successful and stuff like that. So it's kind of like, as you read the books, you don't know which band is going to go from being ordinary kids to like being rock stars at the end of the series. Yeah.
And what kind of music do you listen to generally? What are you listening to right now?
My musical tastes are quite wide. I listen to tons of different stuff. I've actually got a bit of I think it's a slightly embarrassing addiction. The song I keep walking around my house singing at the moment is that David Guetta Titanium song. And I'm always walking around my house or in the shower singing, I am titanium. And it sort of drives me completely mad. So hopefully that will pass fairly soon.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, do you like my singing voice?
Yeah. I think a round of applause for the singing. Yes, definitely. And who is your ultimate favourite band then?
My ultimate favourite band, probably a band that not many people here have heard of, is a band called the Pogues. And they're a sort of Irish band, and they play a mixture of Irish folk music and punk music. And when I was a little bit older than you guys in this room, probably about 15 or 16, and I first started going to gigs, the Pogues used to play lots of concerts in the area where I lived. So the reason that I have really fond memories of the Pogues was that me and my mates on a Saturday night would go and watch the Pogues, and we'd all dance and jump up and down and drink a few beers when we were probably too young and shouldn't have been drinking beers. But I just have really fond memories of being young and seeing that band play live and having a really great time. And sometimes in life, you know, it's not necessarily who plays the best music or what, that sort of thing. It's something that evokes a really good memory. And I just remember the Pogues and think about being, you know, young and new and for going out to clubs and gigs for the first time and having a really, really fun time.
And is that how do you listen to music while you're writing the Rock War series, or do you go and do research on certain bands or gigs and stuff?
Now when I writing is really interesting. I can do most things sitting on a train or, you know, with music playing in the background. I don't mind distractions, but there's something about when I'm actually writing, I have to be in my office and I have to have quiet and I have to have a focused mind, because it's kind of sounds a little bit pretentious, but when I'm writing a book, it's almost like all the characters and all the situations are alive in my head, and it's just kind of me and my keyboard and the screen, and I'm almost kind of living in the story and I'm writing it, and it all feels kind of real and almost like it's actually happening. And I can't do that when I've got distractions and other stuff going on. So when I actually write, I'm really focused. Pretty much anything else, whether it's answering messages from fans or doing my accounts or anything like that, I'll have music on in the background. But when I actually write, it has to be peace and quiet.
Yeah. Going back to before you were a writer, you were a private investigator. Is it as cool as it sounds, and did you do anything really super interesting?
It's funny because the thing of me being a private investigator, I actually worked for a firm called Fraser and Fraser, and what we did was we used to do what was called air hunting. Now, basically, so what we would do, we would go out, someone drops dead, and we would then have to find, and that person has got no relatives, they're living on their own, they don't have any children, their parents are dead, but their money has to go somewhere. Some distant relative is entitled to their money. So we used to actually go round and hunt these people, and we used to find them, and that was my job. So I wasn't a private investigator like it says in the movies. One of the funny things about this, though, is that when I first started and I said what I did to my publisher, and I said, well, I'm an air hunter, and nobody really knew what an air hunter was. And they sort of said, oh, it's actually easier if we say you're a private investigator, because then people understand what that is, and that makes it a bit clearer. But the funny thing is the company that I work for, Fraser and Fraser, just as I was leaving my job, just as my book started taking off, they actually started making a TV series called Air Hunters, which is on the BBC quite often in the morning. I think the series is in like its 12th season now. So actually these days quite a lot more people know what an air hunter is because they watch the TV show about the company that I used to work for.
Cool. Right. One last question about Cherub and Rock War, sort of. What are you going to do after the Rock War series? Have you got an idea? So you've done Spies and you've done music. Have you got something for another series? Have you got an idea of where you want to go from there?
So what I do next actually feels a little bit scary to me at the moment, because ever since I started writing Cherub, or I got my first contract to write Cherub in 2003, I've always had another book to write. I've always had more Cherub books, and then I wrote my Henderson's Boys series, which is the one set in the Second World War. And then by the time I finished writing Henderson's Boys, and I was still doing Cherub, and I thought about doing Rock War. And actually, what I decided a few years ago was, because I've been writing a lot of books, I've written, I think it's 20, when I write the book I'm finishing writing at the moment, I'll have written 28 books in something like 12 or 13 years.
Wow.
And I just decided I was going to take a little bit of a break and not rush into starting on another series or signing another contract. And I'm just going to basically have a think. And I've got some ideas. I've got 3 or 4 ideas for stories. And I'd quite like the idea, the one thing I do really like the idea of is actually writing a standalone book, because I've always written books in series. So I think it would be quite different and quite interesting just to write a single book and a single story about one set of characters. But it's all a little bit of a mess at the moment. And the other thing is I'm a little bit anxious about it, because sometimes having freedom feels quite nice. But now I've written all the books in my contract and I don't quite know what I want to do next. It also feels a little bit nerve-wracking because I don't quite know what I'm going to want to do, and I don't know if people will like it when I've done it.
Yeah, and I suppose a standalone would be a massive challenge because there's an end to it, whereas a series you can think. Oh,
I mean, this is really interesting, because I've always written series of books. Cherub is 17 books. I think it's like 1.8 million words, so it's like it would be twice as long as the longest novel ever written if you bound it all up into one book. And I love that, because what I really like is when I read a book, and I really like the fact that, like in the Cherub series, James starts off and he's only 11 and he's a bit of an idiot and he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life and he's a bit naive, and he sort of grows up and develops through the series, and you see James change to where, like, when you get to the last book in the series, James is actually 24 and he's one of the staff on Cherub campus, and he's a really, really different person. And I love that scope and the bigness and all the things you can do when you write a series. And to me, because I've spent so much of my life writing series, I know most people probably think of writing a book as being like really long and really difficult, but when I just think of telling a whole story and covering all what happens to my characters in just one book, it kind of feels really small, and it's actually quite an interesting challenge for me.
Yeah. Right, guys, so we're going to have a quick game of Would You Rather, and then after that you guys are open to ask some questions, so have a really good think, and then we're going to come to you in a moment. Okay, so based on things you say that you love and hate, would you rather be covered in A, spiders, or B, chutney?
Spiders or chutney? Now, a lot of these hate questions, this all comes down to my big brother. I've got a brother, Del, who's actually a teacher, and he's 8 years older than me. Now, when you've got a brother who's 8 years older than me, obviously, if there's going to be a fight, you're always going to lose because they're so much bigger than you. And my brother used to be a bit horrible to me, but one of the few things that I used to have over my brother when I was a kid was my brother was scared of spiders and I wasn't. I don't know why spiders have never freaked me out or worried me. So one of the horrible things that I would do to my big brother is if there was ever a spider in the house, I'd just like grab it with my fingers and throw it at my brother and completely freak him out. So it was one of the few things when I was a kid that I had over my big brother. So I definitely say I prefer spiders.
Spiders. And would you rather get chased by cows or eat a giant bowl of ketchup?
Cows or ketchup. And again, like a lot of things that I hate, it comes down to my evil big brother, Del. Because Basically, when I was a kid, I never used to like ketchup. And what my brother used to do to me, because I was a lot littler than him, he used to grab me, put his arm around my neck, and then he'd get ketchup on his finger, and he'd hold my nose so I had to open my mouth, and then he'd make me eat ketchup. So to this day, I cannot stand ketchup. And even if I just smell like someone's eating a hot dog or something and it's got ketchup on it, and I can just smell, it just makes me feel queasy and sick, because I've just got this real negative association with ketchup. I also don't like cows, because for some reason cows make me nervous, but I definitely would prefer the cows to the ketchup.
Right. Last one. Eat only chocolate or cheese forever?
Eat only chocolate or cheese forever. I really love both of these things, but I guess I would have to pick chocolate, because like the thought of life without like being able to eat like a Snickers or Maltesers or something like that, I just think that would be too terrible to even contemplate.
Oh, good answer. Good answer. Right. So, have any of you guys got some questions that you want to ask? Okay, Janet's coming around with the microphone, so if you want to take it and stand up.
What was your favourite sport as a child?
What was my favourite sport as a child? Well, I've always quite liked watching sport. I mean, I'm an Arsenal fan, because obviously Arsenal were the greatest team in the world. And but when it actually came to playing sport, I was absolutely useless. Like, you know, the classic scene like you always get in the movies where, you know, everyone's getting picked for sport and it's like, I'll have him, I'll have him, I'll have him. And there's the poor kid who gets picked last. And I was always the kid who got picked last. I was basically a skinny, geeky kid who wore glasses and liked reading loads of books. I was unfortunately never a sporty kind of kid.
Right, we're going to take a question from one of the online schools. So from Glossopdale Community College, how long does it take you to write a book? Which you said 2 months, but with editing and everything.
Yeah, I'll break it. So I'll break so what I said was it takes me 2.5 months to write a book. But the interesting thing about being a writer is that doesn't mean I can get up tomorrow morning and just sit at my keyboard and start writing. That's obviously not how it works. I have to plan the book and research it and think about it first. So probably my research process for a typical book takes me somewhere between 6 weeks to 2 months. So I'll be thinking about what the book's going to be about, who's going to be in it, what the plot's going to be. I'll do lots of research and reading, maybe watch movies, documentaries, basically just get lots of ideas for the book. And then when I've got all those ideas and I've done all that research, this is when I'll come up with my plot. Now, it's interesting because the plot of my books, the chapter plan, basically lists all the details of what happens in every chapter of the book. And it's only on about 6 or 7 pieces of paper, but it actually takes me about 2 weeks just to put this plot together and to like be really intricate and think about all the characters and everything that happens in every chapter of the book. So basically I've done 6 weeks or so of research, a couple of weeks putting my chapter plan together, and then I'm ready to write the book. And the writing process itself takes between 2 to 2.5 months. So the overall process of writing a book, from when I first think I need an idea for a book to when I've actually finished writing the last chapter, is about 4.5 months.
Wow, it's quite a long time. Anyone else? Okay. Victoria's going to bring the mic over to you.
If you were to play an instrument, what would it be?
If I was to play an instrument, I am not very musical, despite the fact that I now write a series of books about kids in bands. And I only had one story really about my musical abilities, and it's actually rather gross. When I was about 8 or 9, like most kids, I started learning the recorder. But the problem with my recorder skills was when I was a little kid, for some reason, I could never just blow. I always used to spit everywhere. And I used to be in recorder class with all the other kids. And like all the other kids would be playing their recorders, and my recorder wouldn't be making any noise because it was basically full of spit, with like spit running out of the end. And it was just really, really gross. And after about 6 recorder lessons, and I think the poor teacher used to have to clean my horrible gobby recorder at the end of the lesson, this teacher just turned around to me and said, you know, I don't think you're cut out for this, Robert. We're not going to give you any more recorder lessons. So that was my musical career. I was basically the worst recorder player in human history.
And quite gross.
Also gross, yeah.
Okay, now from Eton Bank Academy, have any of your books ever been made into movies?
No is the straight answer to that. So what's happened? Lots of people over the last few years, you know, my Cherub books in particular have been really successful, and a company owns the rights to get a Cherub movie made. And we've been trying hard to actually get a movie made. People have written scripts. We've been trying to raise money. But every time I speak to the film people and say, you know, what's going on with the Cherub movie? How long is it going to take? Is it ever going to happen? They always say, oh yeah, it's about 2 years away. And the Cherub movie has now been about 2 years away for about the last 8 years. And the last time I asked them and I spoke to them about this, and they said, you know, how's the movie going? I said, you know, is it all right? And yeah, we're making progress. It's about 2 years away. So I've sort of got this feeling now that maybe the Cherub movie will be 2 years away forever. But fingers crossed, hopefully something will happen and someday we will actually get a movie or a TV series based on my books.
Yes, that'd be fantastic. And from this side, has anyone got? There's lots of questions.
Would you ever like write a series about sport, like in your books?
Would I ever write a series about sport? It's a really interesting question, because one of the things that all my books have in common with Cherub, like lots of people say, like Cherub because it's a spy book, and Rock War because it's about bands, are quite different, but they've actually got one thing in common, and that is, well, I like the idea that when a kid reads my books, I always like them to be realistic, and that the kid can read the book and think this is something really cool and this could happen to me. So in Rock War, it's about I could become a rock star and it's realistic and this could happen to me. And in Cherub, it's about I could become a spy and this could happen to me. So kind of in a way, the sport thing would actually fit in quite nicely, because the idea of like writing a kid about like a kid who's good at football and wants to become a football star or something like that, or a gymnast or whatever it is, would actually possibly work quite well and be similar to my other books. The only reason I think I wouldn't do it, and I'd find it really hard, was just because I wasn't a sporty person, and there are quite a lot of other books out there that have been written that are similar. And I think probably, you know, if you've got a book written by someone who's an ex-footballer or something like that, or an ex-tennis player, I think they would be much better at writing that book than I would, because they've actually got the experience of having lived that life.
Yeah. Okay, and from Aston Academy, when you were at school, what lessons did you enjoy the most?
When I was at school, what lessons did I enjoy the most? I guess I was a bit of a geek, and I quite like maths because I was quite lazy and I was always really good at maths, a bit like James Adams in the Cherub book. So I quite like maths. The lesson I basically hated was PE, because I was just absolutely rubbish at it, and I usually used to end up with, everyone just used to end up taking the mickey out of me, because it's like, oh, Muchamore's missed the ball again, oh, he's fallen over again. So I genuinely didn't like PE very much at all.
But not English?
I was sort of average at English. I guess it depended on the teacher. And I think the thing that really put me off was I had this revolting teacher called Mr. Walker. Actually, he's probably still alive, so he'll probably sue me now. So just forget I said that, everyone who's watching. I had this really horrible English teacher, and he was just bossy and rude, and he was really strict. And he just wasn't very good, and I didn't like him very much. And then when I was a bit older, I had another English teacher called Miss Walder, who was actually really sweet and really nice, and I really liked her. And I got into English and stuff a bit more. But like a lot of subjects at school, it very often depends on having a good teacher. I'm sure all of the teachers at your schools are wonderful, but I think some teachers are a lot more wonderful than others.
And another question from this side.
You said you like the books to be realistic. Would you ever consider writing a fantastical book, maybe vampires, elves, that kind of thing?
The kind of the fantasy, the elves. First of all, when I was very young, I used to sort of like those books. But the problem I would have with writing something like that is I'm not really into that stuff now that I'm an adult. And the second problem is, a bit like I said with the sport one, there are tons of fantasy writers and people who love fantasy. And very often when I meet kids and they say they want to be writers, you know, they want to write the next Game of Thrones or something like that. So I just think there are already so many people out there writing really good fantasy books and stories like that. So I prefer the idea that I actually do something that's a bit different, and I write the kind of books that I would have liked to read when I was a kid, because there's just so many people who do that stuff better than I probably could.
And from Southfield's Academy, which of the Cherub books is your favourite?
Oh, I hate answering questions about which ones of my books is the favourite. And it's a bit like if any of you guys have got siblings, and you know, when you ask your mum or your dad, like, who is your favourite? Which is your favourite child? And no one will say. because they kind of, you love all your kids equally, because, you might even secretly have a favourite, but you're never going to say it. And I really feel like that about my books, because I work really hard on the books, and I think really hard, and they come out and I get all excited about them, and it's really hard to pick a favourite. And if someone forces me to pick a favourite, the one I always say is my favourite is The Recruit, my very first book. And the reason I say The Recruit is my favourite is not because it's the best book that I've written, but just because of the very simple fact that when you are a writer and you write your first book, it's really exciting when the book comes out. And I can remember showing my mum my first book, and she was really excited, and taking it into the office where I used to work, and they got excited. And you get this really cool moment where for the first time ever, you go into a bookstore and you actually see your book with your name on the cover. And it's just wow, I'm actually a real published author with a real book. So it's just a real buzz when your first ever book comes out. And I don't think however successful or whatever books I write, anything will ever feel quite as exciting as just that experience of publishing one book.
Wow, fabulous. And from over this side?
How do you come up with the names for the people in your books?
How do I come up with character names? It's quite an interesting one. Sometimes it's just, if you've got a really standard name, it can just be something really boring, like you just think, oh, John, and that you just kind of pick the name at random. One of the things I noticed once was in my book, it's Maximum Security, my third book, and I've got a character called Miss Oxford, and I've got a character called Miss English, and I've got a character called Miss Shorter, and I didn't actually realise until I did this completely subconsciously, but then I looked around, and on my desk where I write, I had the Shorter Oxford English Dictionary on my desk. So it was kind of weird that I just picked up all the names of the characters from the dictionary that was sitting beside me on my desk. And the other kind of names where you have to do a bit of research is obviously where you get an ethnic name. So for example, in the Cherub series, there's a guy called Mr. Kazakov, and he's Ukrainian. And when I created this character and I decided he was Ukrainian, I had to work out, well, what is a Ukrainian name? I didn't want to accidentally give him a Russian name or just make up a silly name that I thought sounded a bit Ukrainian. And one of the cheats, one of the techniques that I use for doing that is I quite often look up sports teams. So I'll look up the name of Ukrainian politicians or Ukrainian sports teams or athletes or something like that. And then you'll actually get a nice list of some Ukrainian surnames. And that's one of the techniques I use to get those sorts of names. But yeah, those sorts of names can be quite tricky. Most names, to be honest, I just sort of randomly pick in my head as I'm writing the book.
And from Cardinal Wiseman Catholic Technology College, who is your favourite author? Who is
my favourite author apart from myself? Because obviously, once you move on from me, there's a big drop in standard. But I suppose probably my favourite author would be a guy called Truman Capote. And he's sort of quite a literary writer, but in particular he wrote one book called In Cold Blood, and that was published in the 1960s, and it's based on a true story, and it's about some murders that took place. And it's just a really kind of quite sinister, quite creepy book, and it's a true life story. And I've also read lots of his short stories and lots of other things, and I just think he's a really talented writer. And when you're a writer, it's kind of annoying because you often try and be the best writer you can be. And when you read something and you think, I could do better than this, and that does happen sometimes, and you think that's really good. And then when I read Truman Capote and I think how clever he is and how well he writes, and I think, oh God, I'll never be as good as what he is. And that can actually be quite frustrating. But I guess we can always try, if we're playing football in the playground, we might not be as good as Lionel Messi, but we can always try. And I guess it's a bit like me. I'll probably never be as good as Truman Capote, but when I'm writing a book, I will always try.
Yeah, that's great advice. And from this side? The mic's coming around.
Which book was the hardest to make?
Which book was the hardest to make? All books have got different aspects to them, and there are hard scenes to write. Probably the hardest thing, particularly when you write for young people, is when you've got quite a difficult concept. And what you have to do is you have to explain something and you have to get all of the facts across, but you have to do it in a way that young people don't find boring when they read the book. So that's one of the hardest things. In terms of specific books though, it varies quite a lot. Possibly the hardest run to write was the fourth one in the Cherub series, which is called Killing. And the reason it was actually hard was because I kind of wrote the book or planned the book and my publisher didn't like the subject matter, and then I kind of had to change it and tone it down, and it just kind of made the whole process a bit painstaking, and it took a lot longer than any of my other books, and the whole thing was a bit of a nightmare. And it's funny because even now when I pick The Killing up, I think the finished book is okay, but whenever I think about The Killing, it's just like I just remember feeling a bit grumpy and miserable when I was writing that book.
Yeah. And from Glossopdale Community College is another one. If you hadn't have been an author, what would you have done? Would you still be a private investigator?
That's a really interesting question, because when I was doing my old job, and I'd done that job from when I left school when I was about 18, and I think when I finally quit because the Cherub books were starting to become successful, I think I was 31. But I was kind of getting to the stage where I was really fed up with that job and I didn't want to do it anymore. So maybe I would have moved on and done something else. But what that something else would have been, I have absolutely no idea. But I'm sure I would have moved on and done something else by now.
Well, hope so. On this side?
What is your favourite character in your own books?
Favourite character? In the Cherub series, I always say it's James's sister Lauren. The reason I really like writing James's sister Lauren is because they've got this really interesting relationship where James and Lauren love each other, but they're also brother and sister. And you know how it is. We love our siblings. We're very fond of them, but we're basically stuck living in the same house with them, and sometimes we fight with them, and sometimes we kind of hate them. And I love writing that relationship between James and Lauren. So in the Cherub series, Lauren's my favourite character. In the Rock War series, it's going to be Summer. And one of the things that I like about Summer is she's a carer and she looks after her nan. So she's got a really tough life and they're kind of living on benefits, and she's got a nan who's very sick, who's got asthma, and Summer has got all of these problems just doing everything in her life because basically she spends a lot of her time looking after her nan, and she has to cook the dinner and do the shopping, and they've never got a lot of money. And I just find that makes Summer a really interesting character to write just because she has this really tough life.
Yeah. And another question from the Cardinal Wiseman School. What was your favourite book when you were a child?
Favourite book when I was a child? I think we already touched on this, and it was really, I love the Asterix books. I used to read them obsessively, and it was funny because I was ill about 5 years ago, and I was just sort of in bed, and you know when you feel really rubbish and you don't really feel like doing anything, but you can't just sit doing nothing all day. And I actually found my old Asterix books and I got them out. And the thing that struck me was, even having not read any of them for over 20 years, was I'd read them so much when I was a kid, I could still remember almost every single word in the books because I just used to love them and like read them completely obsessively when I was a kid.
And the drawings are fantastic, aren't they? Amazing.
The drawings and stuff as well, yeah.
And another question from you guys over this way.
Do you think you'd ever quit writing?
Do I think I'd ever quit writing? One of the things about being a writer, I guess, is, you know, most people, if you have a job, you know, you get to a certain age and you take a pension and you retire. And I think one of the things about being a writer is you don't necessarily retire or just stop writing, but you can sort of slow down. So, you know, maybe I will still want to write a book in 20 or 30 years' time, but maybe, you know, if I'm older or whatever, I might just write a book every few years, or, you know, just write books that I want to write. I think I'll probably always write for the rest of my life. The question is what I write and how often I write, rather than whether I'll completely stop.
Yeah. And from Southfields Academy, how did you come up with the Cherub logo and name?
The Cherub logo and name. So the Cherub logo, is it on a big poster behind? Yeah, the Cherub logo is this one here, for those of you who don't know. When I started writing the Cherub spy books, there were a few other like kids spy series around, and they all had quite cheesy, quite obvious names. And there was like Spy Boy and Spy Dog and Secret Agents and Special Agents, and they all had these sorts of names. And I just wanted people to pick up a Cherub book and think, this is a bit weird, this is a bit unusual, I don't quite know what this is. So it's what as writers we call a hook. So I kind of wanted Cherub to have this weird baby logo and a name that people didn't quite understand. And I think it worked quite well, because a lot of people who I know read Cherub books are people who don't like reading other spy books and don't like reading other thrillers. So I actually think it worked really well, giving Cherub this slightly weird, quirky name.
Yeah. And the logo, you had influence on the logo? Or?
So the logo is based on, in the very first book, there was a description of the Cherub logo. And what actually happened, it's quite interesting, because David, the guy who used to design my book covers and the logo, David said, actually, this is a really hard thing to draw. So he actually came up with a Cherub logo that was similar but slightly different. And then we actually changed the description in the book to match the logo that he'd drawn, because that was much easier than him making a logo that I described in the book.
And does anyone else have a question from this side?
Everyone.
Everyone.
Would you ever consider writing an autobiography?
Would I consider writing an autobiography? I guess the thing about me is like I've actually led a fairly boring life. I mean, the thing about being a writer, you know, you sit in a room and write. I left school when I was 18. I had a fairly ordinary job. I then became a writer. It's not like I, you know, climbed Everest or rode down the Nile or, you know, jumped off a mountaintop or something like that. I'm actually not that exciting. So I don't think I would ever write an autobiography. I might maybe base a story on things that have happened to me in my life. But to be honest, I think my autobiography wouldn't be that exciting.
You haven't done those things yet.
Yeah, I mean, I could, you know, go and jump off a mountain just so I've got something to write in an autobiography. That's one possibility.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take one more
Actually,
question.
you can't really jump off a mountain. You sort of fall down a mountain, really, don't you?
Yeah, and you probably wouldn't be around to write the book then.
Damn it. Yeah, that's that plan ruined. Anyway, I'll have to put more thought into this.
So I'm going to take one more question from online and then one more question from you guys. So have a good think. From Aston Academy, what advice would you give to your younger self?
What advice would I give to my younger self? Do you know, I think one of the things I would probably say to my younger self is just to be a little bit bolder and a little bit more out there, because I wasn't particularly shy. I've always been a bit of a gobby person and I'm quite happy to speak, but very often when it came to making a decision, like something simple like joining a club or asking a girl out, or, you know, do I go to a party, and you sort of fret and you get anxious about it. And I guess one of the things that I've found in my life is that usually when you actually do something, you usually end up enjoying it, but we often sort of worry ourselves out of doing things. And I'd love to go back to my teenage self and just say, you know, just have fun, just relax, just don't worry so much about everything. And, you know, basically, what's the worst thing that can happen if you actually did this and tried this?
Yeah, it's brilliant advice. Right, one last question from someone over here. Yeah, microphone's come to you.
Do you have any tips for people who want to start writing?
Any tips for people that want to start writing? That's a really good question to finish on, because I know loads of young people want to be writers. The one thing that I always encourage people to do, two things really. The first one is to read. Now, obviously, if you want to be a writer, you're almost certainly going to be someone who likes reading books, but don't just read the stuff that you like. Don't, you know, if you like fantasy books and you want to be a fantasy writer, don't just read fantasy books. Move out of your comfort zone, read a thriller, read a romance, read a literary novel, because by reading lots of different books and seeing how lots of different genres work, you actually get a much better understanding of books and stories. And the second part of that is an extension of that: write lots of different things. So don't just sit down and say, right, I'm 14 years old, I like fantasy books, I'm going to write a fantasy novel, and you just start typing away. That's not a very good idea. It's a good idea to actually sit down and say, I'm going to have a go at a fantasy, and I'm going to write a thriller, and I'm going to write lots of different things. And one of the main reasons I give this advice is because I got really stuck. When I was about 18, 19, and I first thought seriously about being a writer, I thought I wanted to write a long, serious adult novel, and my ambition was to win something like the Costa Prize or the Booker Prize or something like that. And I spent a lot of time trying to write books like that, and I wasn't very good at it. And it was only when I got older and I experimented and I started thinking about writing for kids and doing different things, and when I started writing for people like you people in this room, then I sort of found I was a bit better at it and I was a lot happier. So play around and experiment, because you may be surprised by what you're good at.
Brilliant. Right, well, that's the end, I'm afraid. Thank you all so much for all your amazing questions, and everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning in and your questions. Don't forget, Robert's next book is out on March the 10th, so if you want to follow up to Rock War, boot camp's out. And also don't forget, it's World Book Day to redeem your Book Day tokens. Can you give everyone a round of applause to Robert?
Thank you.
Well done.
And thanks to everyone for all the really great questions as well.
Brilliant.
Can I go home now?